Welcome to Creativity in the Time of COVID-19. This is the first collaborative program that we've done online between Science and Entertainment Exchange and the Office of Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences. And we're very excited about this. And I'm joined here with, first of all, I'm J.D. Slosik. I'm the Director of Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences. And joining me here is Ann Merchant. Many of you know is the Deputy Executive Director of Communications at the NAS, or at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. And also the Director of the Science Entertainment Exchange, Rick Leverett. We're very glad that you're joining us today. But before we get started, a lot of people ask us, what is the National Academy of Sciences? What is it that we do? The NAS is it's a nonprofit, non-government organization. It was chartered by Congress and signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. So the NAS came into existence during a time of stress. It was during the Civil War. And it's times of conflicts, uncertainty, and unrest that a strong voice of scientific knowledge and reasoning is really needed. So the NAS mission is now, as it was then, to provide independent and objective advice to the nation and to the public on issues related to science and technology. And so the goal of Ann, Rick's, and my programs, the creative and cultural programs within the NAS is to engage with the public and to illuminate the roles of science, that science plays in every aspect of our lives and in society. Culture programs, that we strive to do this through art exhibits and performing arts. And we also have an ongoing program of art science salons called DASER, or DC Art Science Evening Rendezvous. We've been hosting these for almost 10 years, and we've now moved them online. So you can join us on the third Thursday of every month. Ann, can I push this over to you and tell us a little bit about your programming and the Science and Entertainment Exchange?
Absolutely, sure. Thank you, JD. And we want to say how happy we are to be doing this partnered event with the cultural programs. Sometimes when we're in our physical location, we've done a couple of collaborations. I'll admit that one time I actually put a hole in a painting, a very valuable painting at the National Academy of Sciences. I wasn't sure JD was going to talk to me after that. So I'm glad we're here doing this, and I promise I won't break anything. I promise.
Okay, great.
So the work that we do at the academies, as JD said, it's really about sort of engaging broad audiences that are not well served perhaps by the core work of the institution. We put out, I have a colleague who used to like to say a PhD-sized thesis every business day of the year, and not everybody wants to read those. So we like to be able to encourage audiences to connect with the content of the institution specifically, but much more broadly with science, engineering, and medicine through some of the creative programming that we both do. And part of that, about 10 years ago, we had created the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a program that connects with the entertainment industry, primarily in Los Angeles, and primarily focused on film and television, to be able to improve the depictions of science and scientists in what we see on screen. So Rick, JD and I are on the East Coast, but I can hand it over to the West Coast, where Rick is the director, as JD said, of the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
Hi, just to say a few quick things. The Science and Entertainment Exchange, as Ann said, we've existed for about a decade. It's basically our job to be the bridge between scientists and engineers and medical professionals with folks in the entertainment industry telling mass media stories for the biggest audiences in the world. We've done over 300 events, 300 consults in which we brought in scientists and engineers and medical professionals to speak to storytellers as they're creating big projects like Avengers Infinity War, Man of Steel, Black Panther, Captain Marvel. If you are a STEM professional and you haven't heard of us and you're just tuning in now for the first time, we're always looking for more people who are interested in this kind of engagement with the entertainment industry. So please do contact us. You can find us on our website. My email's on there. We'll totally get back to you and would love to engage. Little bit about what you're about to see. You're going to hear 3 speakers. I'm going to be behind the scenes looking down here. There's a little bubble that says Q&A. If you click on that bubble at any time during any of the talks or the performance and ask a question, I'm going to be sort of collating those. We have an excruciatingly short amount of time for questions, so we're very sorry if we don't get to yours. It's totally my fault. We will try to get to as many as we possibly can at the end. And thanks again, and back to Anne.
Well, I'm going to tell you right off the bat that you undersold yourself, because you said we'd done 300 consults since we launched. And I think you want to add a 0 to that, I know, because it's 3,000. Yes,
300
exactly.
events. Yeah, sorry about that.
Exactly. I have been starting our events with little tidbits, little things that I've been sort of looking at online, things that remind me about why it's important for us to connect with our audiences on a regular basis. And reminiscent of today's programming, I wanted to tell you about the singing librarian. So you can dial a number and you will connect with the singing librarian. I'm looking at my notes to tell you she's in Park Ridge, Illinois at the public library there. And on Thursdays, you can call in and she will sing to you. I think it's not an individual song. I think it's recorded. The 847-220-7053. So call the singing librarian. The other thing is, and I've seen, I know others have probably seen this, there were great pictures and we put it in our slide deck leading into this. When the Barcelona Opera House reopened, they did so in a very safe and socially distanced way by playing to an audience of 2,292 plants. And I read that it was palms, snake plants, fiddle leaf ferns, and monsteras, otherwise known as the Swiss cheese plant. So there's some things you may not have known. And I think we're going to hear from 3 speakers who will tell us a lot about things maybe that we didn't know before. And we have kind of a nice little arc here. We have a physician who is going to speak to us first about the way in which music can be prescribed in hospitals and clinical settings. Then we're very fortunate to have somebody that will actually perform for us. And then we'll hear from a neuroscientist who will explain about what's actually happening in our brains. I would also tell you that the 2 scientists that we have speaking, they're also musicians as well. So it's kind of nice when you have such talented people in the lineup. So I'm going to pass it back to another talented person, and that's you, JD, because you're going to go from here.
Thanks, Anne. That's wonderful. It's always good to work with you, especially when you're not tearing things up. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Claudius Conrad, who's our first guest. One might say that Claudius is one of our heroes working on the front line and fighting in the war against COVID. But the use of these sort of warlike metaphors causes us to lose sight of the fact that our medical providers, our physicians and our nurses, they're practitioners that are healers, people who are caring for the whole person and not just treating a disease. Claudius has PhDs in both biology and in music philosophy. He has a unique approach to practicing medicine, one that combines tools from medicine and the humanities. And as Anne said, he's both a surgeon, a clinician, and a pianist. So his list of appointments is extensive and it includes his role as chief of general surgery and surgical oncology at St. Elizabeth Medical Center, and he has served as the director of music and medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Claudius, thank you for being here. We're so delighted to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I feel very honored to be here today. And I've been asked to share a little bit about what I experienced with COVID coming on and how music and creativity played a role. So in order to do that, I would like to start to share a patient with you. Her name is Lisa, who is 43 years old. And I would like to connect her story with some of the data we have generated on how music can help not only patients, but also physicians and family members of patients. So Lisa is 43 years old. She developed abdominal pain. She saw her primary care physician who drew labs that were normal. And so she went on about her life. And a few weeks after that appointment, she turned yellow. She developed jaundice, and this prompted now a more extensive workup. She had a CT scan and labs drawn that rendered the diagnosis of a mass in the head of the pancreas. And that's how she came to see me. I'm a liver pancreas surgeon, and there was a concern that she has pancreatic cancer. So Lisa came to see me and we have music in our waiting room. And in this context, we have designed a study to investigate the effect of music on relatives of patients, rather patients themselves. Because we think that relatives of patients are overall under-investigated. And in the study, we found out that music can be surprisingly effective in reducing anxiety of family members. And to be more specific, it can reduce not only your situational anxiety, but also your entire outlook on life, and to a degree that is comparable what you can achieve with sedative medication and anxiolytic medication. And that was very impressive to find. And we also find that there are subpopulations among relatives of patients who are especially susceptible to being treated with music in the waiting room. And those were females who were waiting by themselves alone. And interestingly, a lower degree, contrary to how you would think it would be, a lower degree of formal education correlated to a higher degree of being relaxed to music. So I saw Lisa in my clinic, and typically now if you develop pancreatic cancer, the first approach is giving some chemo, so-called neoadjuvant chemotherapy, prior to moving forward with surgery. So Lisa started chemo. It's a pretty tough chemo. And after 4 cycles of chemo, so after 2 months, I saw Lisa back. She had a pretty good response to chemotherapy, and after a 1-month waiting period, she was ready for surgery. At that point, the COVID epidemic was in full swing. All elective surgery had been basically canceled, but patients who are coming off chemotherapy, cancer patients, that is not really elective surgery. We know that delaying surgery, cancer surgery, can lead to progression and to poor outcome. So Lisa proceeded with her surgery, and she had a laparoscopic pancreaticoduodenectomy, which is a very complicated operation of removing the head of the pancreas. And in that context, I want to share with you that we have investigated the role of music on the OR team and team dynamics in the operating room. We have looked at how music can help surgeons to improve their performance in the operating room and change their performance in the operating room. And we have also looked at what surgeons can learn from professional musicians to improve their performance as surgeons. And I want to share just some data points of those 3 studies. So if we look at music in the operating room and music to improve team dynamics, we have to consider that the OR team is surprisingly heterogeneous. Somebody who becomes a liver pancreas surgeon has a totally different personality than an anesthesiologist, than a nurse, a trainee, a different personality than a staff. And we found that music can help to synchronize a heterogeneous team to the best possible outcome of patients. And we know from marches and other types of music that music has the ability to coordinate performance. In that case, it's the best possible outcome for our patients. I wanted to share with you another study where in a virtual reality environment, we allowed surgeons to operate under 4 conditions: either silence, either auditory stress, either mental stress, or carefully selected classical music. The mental stress was simulated by having the surgeon do mathematical subtraction tasks. And auditory stress was so-called dichotic music, which is 2 different types of music in each ear: German folk music in one ear, death metal in the other ear, specifically designed to be very stressful. So the results of the study were that under auditory stress, there's a subpopulation of surgeons who is uniquely impacted by it in a negative way. And those are typically surgeons with a higher degree of a musical background. And there are other factors in a surgeon's life that we investigating how auditory stress impacts the performance of the surgeon in the operating room. We then also looked at the performance under mental loading, meaning mental stress, and everybody is bad. And we also looked at improvement of the performance. And while there are some that improved under auditory stress, nobody was good under mental stress, and people didn't improve, surgeons didn't improve under mental loading. And what was very interesting was that we found a conditioning effect with classical music. We found that surgeons were as good as in silence when listening to classical music, but we found the highest degree of improvement in performance measured as speed and accuracy when the surgeon listened to well-selected classical music. So we think that there's a conditioning effect with the motor performance when the music is played again to the surgeon. There's a better recall of what has been learned. And thirdly, we looked at what surgeons can learn from professional musicians to improve their performance in the operating room. And important aspects are the ways to deal with stage fright, deliberate practice. And in this context, you have to imagine a concert situation for a pianist when he or she want to perform the most beautiful music when they're under the most stress on stage, which is similar to a surgeon who wants to have the most sensitivity to the feedback tissue gives him or her when there's a bleeding or emergency situation. And those are things that can be specifically learned, and those are things that I now pass on to my fellows in the operating room. So Lisa did well with the surgery, and she recovered on the floor, and it was a tough time because family members couldn't visit their relatives in the hospital due to the social distancing restriction, and Lisa was alone. And talking with her, she told me what connects her the most to her family, besides calling them over the phone, was listening to music. She played with her children and her family members. So Lisa did well, and ultimately was ready to be discharged. And at the day of discharge, Lisa developed fever. So as a surgeon, the first thought should be that this fever is somehow related to your surgery. And we did a workup but that also included a COVID-19 test. So Lisa tested positive for COVID-19, and her condition worsened rapidly in that she had to be transferred to the intensive care unit and had to be placed on a ventilator. And in that context, I would like to share a study with you where we randomized patients that were severely sick to two arms, one that would listen to the slow movements of Mozart's piano sonatas, and another arm that would just listen to silence. And the patients were intubated, they would slowly wake up and then listen to Mozart, because it is very important that you wake up intensive care patients every day to measure their neurologic status, to let them breathe on their own in order to recruit their lung and maintain their lung capacity. In that study where we drew blood before and after the music intervention, we looked at parameters of the human stress response, and we were the first group to develop a pathway that might confer stress reduction secondary to music. And what we found was that when those patients, and I think also us, when we listen to music, then growth hormone is secreted from the brain. And at the same time we were conducting the study, a different group had found out that cells of inflammation have on their surface a receptor for growth hormone that then secretes a chemical to a lesser degree called interleukin-6. Interleukin-6 is a chemical cells of inflammation use to communicate with each other. And the lesser degree of secretion of interleukin-6 then led to a lesser degree of secretion of stress hormones from the adrenal gland, such as adrenaline, norepinephrine, and others. And that for the first time kind of showed a pathway of stress reduction. So when Lisa was ventilated in the intensive care unit. We played music for her. We you know, tried everything to make her overcome COVID-19. She received reconvalescent plasma, which is blood plasma from patients, from healthy volunteers who had recovered from COVID-19. She also received remdesivir, and despite all of this, her condition worsened, and ultimately Lisa passed away and died the day she passed. Her family members were allowed to come to the hospital, but it was a very challenging and sad situation for the family, of course, but also for the entire team. And we found that we were able to recover from this trauma of losing a patient who had gone through chemotherapy, responded well to it, who had gone through a long 8-hour challenging surgery, recovered well from it, but ultimately was lost to COVID-19. And you know, I can tell you from my personal experience, playing music, and music is always an expression of what we experience. That was an important part of my life to recover from this. I hope that with this, I was able to share a personal story, but also some data on how we investigate the role for music in medicine and how diverse its application can be for patients, for family members, but also for health professionals such as surgeons. And with that, I leave you, and I'll be available for Q&A at the end. And again, I would like to thank the organization for having me today.
Claudius, thank you so much for being with us. Such a personal and touching story, and we look forward to asking you more questions at the end. So now I'd like to introduce you to Andrew Janss. Andrew, along with his partner Molly Carr, are co-directors of Project Music Will Heal Us. It's an organization that the pandemic brought music to marginalized communities, nursing homes, and even to prison systems, with the idea that music goes far beyond pleasure and entertainment. It heals us as individuals, as well as connects us to one another. We were introduced to Andrew and Molly through our friend Lisa Wong, who is a pediatrician and musician who co-directs the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School. So Lisa has a firsthand knowledge, having worked with Andrew and Molly and through the Boston connections of how this project works. And as a cellist, Andrew has performed with artists such as Itzhak Perlman, Pinchas Zukerman, Bruce Springsteen, and Lana Del Rey. He performs with the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center and has toured with cello rock band Break of Reality throughout Asia and the Americas. Andrew, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Project Music Heals Us was founded with a mission to create inspiration and community through live arts to people who don't usually have access to them. There are many corners of the world where people who could probably most benefit from the innate beauty, the cognitive workout, and mostly the feeling of understanding and oneness that the live arts can provide. These people are, for the most part, completely shut out from it. And our goal is to reach as many of these people as possible. Before the COVID pandemic, what that meant was concerts and workshops in prisons, nursing homes, homeless shelters, refugee camps, and AIDS centers, all places that have actually been disproportionately hard hit by the virus. So many arts organizations that do incredible work were forced to reimagine what their programming is in this kind of new age of quarantine. And many, including us, tried their hand at streaming digital concerts online on Facebook and other mass consumption platforms. For us, there was something missing in these kind of mass consumption concerts. And it was the personal connection that we felt when we worked live with groups of people who were so intensely engaged and appreciative and enjoyed the music that we were able to bring to them. So we determined as an organization that we would try something kind of radically different. So instead of trying to reach a mass of people over the internet, which in some cases felt like, you know, just one step removed from watching a YouTube video, that we would instead try and have as profound an impact on one person at a time as possible. So because musicians were quarantined at home solo, they didn't usually have like teams of musicians with them. We determined that we would have one musician play concerts for one patient at a time. And with the help of an incredible doctor and also musician, former professional clarinetist named Rachel Easterwood, who was the attending night manager at the Allen Hospital, which is in Inwood, Manhattan, one of the hardest hit hospitals during the height of the pandemic in New York. We were able to start giving these concerts on iPads that were being used in other times for telemedicine and for connecting patients with their families. Yeah, it was, what can I say? The one-on-one concerts were for these patients who were suffering not just from the virus itself, but also from this intense isolation that Dr. Conrad was describing, where not only did the patients feel isolated from their families and from the world, but also from their doctors, who were instructed to not be in the room with them for more than the absolute minimum amount of time, or maximum amount of time possible. So these concerts for us as musicians were unlike anything that we've ever given before. Beyond the fact that it was a one-to-one concert, which created this kind of intense personal experience, it was also the addition of the heart rate monitors, the ventilating machines breathing for the patients. You could actually hear in some cases, you know, a patient's heart rate coming down as you played the music for them. And we've gotten, admittedly anecdotal notes from all of the medical staff talking about how they haven't seen a patient smile until, you know, weeks into their stay when they finally got to have one of these concerts, or that a patient who was in great distress was finally able to relax throughout the course of a concert. You know, it's hard for us to speak as musicians on the medical effects that these kinds of concerts have, but working with these incredible teams of doctors and nurses, physicians assistants, and in some cases language coordinators, we're just so happy that we're able to do our small part to help everybody get through this pandemic together. So with that, I want to pass it to the AV team to show just a small clip about a video piece that was made about these concerts. Hi. So with that, I want to just play you two short pieces. These are pieces that I've used in these concerts. The first one is by a composer named J.S. Bach. For a cellist, he wrote 6 cello suites. They're really kind of the Bible of the cello. You can't learn the cello without learning Bach. And one of the preludes to one of the suites is one of the most famous pieces written for the cello. It's also just a very, very centering piece of music. So this is the prelude to the G major cello suite, and I hope you enjoy. The way we choose the pieces of music, it depends a lot on the population of patients that we're playing for. If a patient is intubated and we don't have the chance to communicate with them, we try and keep the music to a very, very kind of even, steady pace to make sure that we're not doing anything to aggravate. If a patient is awake and is able to talk with us, we tend to ask them what they want to hear, and a lot of people want to hear beautiful singing music on the cello. That's what they associate with the cello. So one of the pieces that I tend to play in these concerts is a piece by Camille Sasson called The Swan from the Carnival of the Animals. Usually this is played with a piano accompaniment, and I wouldn't usually play it in public, but for these concerts it's felt very appropriate. So I'll end my section of the event with Camille Sasson's The Swan.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was so wonderful. As you were playing, I was trying to imagine myself in the position of the patient listening to this, and what a wonderful gift.
Well, thank you for having me today, and thank you for
Andrew. We'll look forward to bringing you back in for the Q&A. And now I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Andrea Viscontis, who is a neuroscientist and, as Ann said, a soprano. She worked with Ann and Rick before at the Science and Entertainment Exchange, and I guess they were kind enough to her. She agreed to come back and be with us again. Her expertise as a neuroscientist and an opera director fits nicely with this ensemble of speakers, pun intended. Andrea is on the faculty at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and the University of San Francisco, and she is the creative director of the Pasadena Opera. She hosts the science podcast, Inquiring Minds, and is the author of the book, How Music Can Make Us Better, or Make You Better. Welcome, Andrea. We're glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. So the first rule of performing is never follow a great solo cellist. So I'm breaking that rule right now. But as you probably all know now, music works. The question I'm going to try to add some knowledge to is how. And in order to answer that question, I want to ask you to think about music not just as one entity, one task, one process, but rather as a tool, like a Swiss Army knife, that we use for many different purposes. And so when it comes to our brains, whether it's how it's supporting music or how it's affected by music, it depends on many ways in which the music is being used. One thing I do want to say right off the bat, though, is that music is very subjective, and that subjectivity depends on our prior exposure to music, on our current context, on two sensitive periods, very early childhood and usually around our teenage years, where we set down our musical tastes and we bond with people that share our musical tastes. And to really underscore the fact that music isn't music out in the ether, it's what our brains do to sound that makes it musical. And so as we each have individual brains, we each will have an individual response to music. I think that's particularly important when it comes to clinical settings, because if you look at the bulk of studies that have been done, and we find that about half of the studies, when it's just specific to, say, easing of pain or reducing anxiety before medical procedures and afterwards, only about half of them show that music is significantly more beneficial than an active control condition. And I think that's to do with the fact that music is so subjective. And so the dosage, exactly what type of music you're using and how you're using it is really important, and we need to learn more about it. But once the brain decides that the sound waves that are entering it are music, we listen differently. And what we listen for are meaningful, often patterns, but some other meaning that goes beyond just the superficial. One brain system that is activated both when playing and listening and seems to be at the core of how we interpret music is the limbic system, which is the border between our cortex, where our most complex thinking happens, and our subcortical structures, where our most primitive emotions are wrought. And so there is this connection between these brain regions, and that's why music can affect us, even in terms of raising the flesh on our arms if we get the chills, because it's connecting these two systems. We decide that what we're listening to is music. We listen for these different meaningful patterns. Many times they have some relationship to memory and emotion, because that really is what the limbic system is all about. The limbic system also drives our motivated behaviors. And that's why when we think about what sort of drives us to do things, music can be a very powerful motivator. It can make us feel as if we want to go out and go for a run, or it can make us feel as if we want to finally, apologize and mend fences with people that we're in conflict with. Mozart is often used in these settings, in part, I think, because his music really taps into going beyond just the superficial sound, but rather both the heartbreak and the beauty of what it means to be human. Same with Bach and Saint-Saëns, as we just heard. So, given that that's a kind of overview of how music might affect us, and understanding now its direct relationship with the limbic system, let's think for a minute how it might affect a person who is listening in a clinical context. And here, again, depending on the type of music, it can have different effects. But let's say we're talking about the most effective way, where, as Dr. Conrad described, we have this easing of stress, and that we can see that, and it's boosting of an immune response. We've seen that in many different situations. In fact, one of my favorite studies shows that when listening to music, colonoscopies go faster. That's good for the patient and for the doctor. People with cancer who sing also do seem to show a boost in their immune system function. And so that goes beyond just listening. So we can see these measurable effects. But one of the ways in which this happens is because when we're listening to music that is meaningful to us, we see a number of different systems activated. And let's just start with the neurotransmitters and the hormones, because those are some of the ones that have been most studied in the world of music neuroscience. So we see a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is often called the pleasure chemical, increase as we listen to music that moves us, especially if we get the chills, which is that, sublime nervous system response to music, the goosebumps. Dopamine is often mischaracterized as just a pleasure chemical. In fact, it really drives a lot of the limbic system in terms of assigning meaning. So dopamine levels are high even when we're going through negative emotional experiences. And I like to think of it as the salience chemical, because even when we learn new information, we see increases in dopamine levels. It's the part of our brain that is really interested in learning something new. Because if we had to sort of distill the brain's function down to one thing, I would argue that it would be about predicting the future, so that we can make better decisions and survive another day. This is why our memory, by the way, is so bad. Remembering details from the past, but enables us to imagine a potential future. That's really what it's there for. So dopamine is involved in giving us a sense of pleasure when we discover something new. And when you think about music, if with so much of it being a part of patterns and all of these different layers of meaning, that's usually what we find really enjoyable, is uncovering these layers of meaning. So dopamine is involved in that process. Another hormone and neurotransmitter, oxytocin, also increases when we listen to music that's moving us. And this hormone has been called the love hormone, which is also a bit of a simplification. But it is involved in situations in which we find ourselves binding with other people. So music, we know, is a very strong social glue. There are hardly any rituals that don't include some aspect of music. And we see levels of oxytocin rise when people are listening to music, especially when they are in sync with each other, dancing or somehow bopping to the rhythm. One of my favorite studies is one where they actually had people spray oxytocin in their nose through a nasal spray, and it improved their rhythm. So if that's a problem for you, you might want to snort some oxytocin. If we bounce babies even to rhythm, those babies actually feel more bonded. They exhibit behaviors where they are more active with the people that bounce them in sync than say to a stranger who didn't. We also behave more altruistically once we have engaged with someone in synchronous bouncing that's raised our oxytocin levels. So we're kinder to each other. So that's another way in which music can help us feel less alone. Sometimes people ask me, well, why is it that sad music feels so good? I mean, let's just listen to two pieces, by Bach and Saint-Saëns that arguably are sad. And, we don't want to feel more sad. We try to avoid feeling sad. But when we listen to these pieces, we actually also see increases in another neurotransmitter hormone called prolactin, which is involved when we cry. And there's a reason why it feels good to have a good cry. There's a release that happens afterwards. And it turns out that sad music that we find beautiful also has a similar effect. And we can then release some of this emotion in a context that is much safer than a context that makes us cry outright. So I think that that's really one of the powers of music in this context. So if I had to kind of sum up what music in this kind of a context might accomplish and how it works on the brain, how does it ease pain? How does it reduce anxiety and facilitate healing? I would say it comes down to essentially four things. One, it provides a distraction. And as you know, in these kinds of environments, there can be a lot of auditory stimulation that is aversive. It also gives you pleasure. So in addition to dopamine and oxytocin, it also releases endogenous opioids and makes us feel good. It lowers our stress hormones, as Dr. Conrad described. And essentially, it makes us feel less alone because we can find bonds with each other. And that is why music is has such a powerful role to play, even in cases where the person's self has become fractured, say, in patients with Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back over, I think, to JD.
I think we're going to go to Q&A right now. So I'm just going to jump in and ask our speakers to come back on video. Hi, everybody. We have a time. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A right now. So I'm going to ask a question that was asked several times in different versions and then move on and give you a second to think about it. The question is, can you name maybe a few, let's call it 3 songs that are from your general playlist that you would recommend the audience listen to sort of in the genre from today? Not to put you on the spot, please think about that. I'm going to ask you, I think this question's probably for Indre, but I'm not 100% sure. Do different instruments have different impacts? Is there anyone who's sort of tried to measure that?
Yeah, so again, I think it depends very much. There's a lot of variability amongst people. So it depends on the population that you're studying, what musical instruments will have an impact. As we talked about, different cultures will have different instruments that are used most often. And because we have these very formative periods in our lives when we lay down our musical tastes and when they get really associated with feelings of nostalgia and belonging, that can be very individual. And, of course, people have different ways in which they hear different instruments. So far, there hasn't been a kind of study definitively that has said this particular instrument is really effective, except for one. And I will lay out my bias here as a soprano. The singing voice seems to be used in many, many cultures and genres. But there again, you have people who will disagree vehemently about whose voice they prefer. So that's what I would say. If I had to pick one instrument, I would say universally be the voice. And one of the reasons why some of the stringed instruments like the cello and the violin are often, especially the cello, are used frequently is because they have the same range as the human voice. And as Andrew mentioned, we like to hear them sing.
Okay, so Claudius, we had a few people asking where they might be able to find some of the studies you referenced. Is there any website or somewhere that you might direct them?
Yeah, so we have compiled not only some of the studies, but also the music on a webpage we created that is www.cconrad.net, so cconrad.net, and there you can listen to the music. We used in a couple of our studies for free, and there's a link to at least the abstracts that are published in PubMed in journals of our field, surgical journals.
Okay, so please don't forget that I am about to ask you for a couple of songs that you guys, each of you would recommend, but also I think this is from the perspective of each person on this panel. Maybe we'll go in the order that you spoke. Do you find that audio quality makes a difference in the impact of the music when you're playing for people?
I could probably speak to this. This is one of the major issues that we've had in launching a digital music platform, because in each hospital, a lot of hospitals are kind of handcuffed to a certain platform. Some are using Zoom, some are in Microsoft Teams, others can use FaceTime, Starleaf. It's so patchwork, and the different platforms all have different sound algorithms. And what we found is that you really have to sound check really, really carefully to make sure that, because the most beautiful player can turn into a screaming banshee over Zoom if you don't know how to account for it. And it can become very untherapeutic very, very quickly. So it is incredibly important to make sure that you're not just assuming that your beautiful playing is translating through the digital medium.
I think Andrew has a really important point here. You know, we think of music like a medication, like a drug, where the dosing is important. And in the context of music, we have shown that if music is played too soft or too loud, so if the noise pressure level is off, both can induce stress. So it is important that you get the dosing of music right. And the clarity is certainly an aspect, and something very well intended can turn into stress, as Andrew was saying, if that is not accounted for.
Yeah, I've heard a single violinist sound like a German folk song and a death metal band all in one. It's not pleasant.
Amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and ask now that you've had maybe a moment to think about it. Are there 2 or 3 songs that you might recommend for a playlist?
So I can jump in there. One is from the science. So one of my colleagues, Biliary Center, has done a number of studies looking at songs that induce the chills. And so because even though this is very subjective, so it doesn't work for everyone, but the one piece that she found was most likely to give you the chills is Barber's Adagio for strings. There are a number of versions of this, but if you listen to it, it's got this slow build until the sun, comes out at the very end, and it's been called the saddest piece of music ever written. So I think when it comes to boosting prolactin, hitting the dopamine system, and on a first listen to be really effective, Barber's Adagio for strings. Secondly, to me, the Marriage of Figaro is the best piece of music ever written. It has so many layers of complicated characters, and it's a comedy, but it ends with forgiveness. And so that's one big, massive piece. And then finally, I just recently interviewed a really interesting woman named B.L. Sherrill, who is formerly incarcerated, and she's the deputy director of a label called Die Jim Crow Records. And they produce very high quality songs by people who are currently or formerly incarcerated. And so I would recommend people check them out.
Yeah, if you ask me, my PhD looked a lot at Mozart. I didn't used to be a big fan of him, but I had to diametrically change my mind. And but now that I'm a little bit older, I think I have more zoomed in on the late romantic composers. So for our work, where we look at culturally neutral music, which we are working on in a collaboration with NASA for prolonged space missions, where astronauts from various cultural backgrounds will be living together for a very, very long time. We found that there are compositional elements that we are trying to synthesize and extract that transcend genres. And I have to say that Mozart is a master of some of those elements. And if you look at some of the aspects the music industry has used for marketing, so-called music, Mozart is a master of that and hits all of them. For just to give you one example, when you listen to Mozart, you think there's a theme that is repeated throughout, for example, the slow movements of his piano sonatas. And if you take a deeper dive into the composition, you will find it's actually not a repetition, it's a variation that is so subtle that you hear something that you are becoming familiar with because it is very similar, but it doesn't create the stressor of boredom because it is actually a subtle variation, just to give you one compositional element of relaxation piece.
So there are so many great questions here, and normally I say last question. I've just been told that we're out of time. Andrew, do you have anything you wanted to add real quick? Any last song recommendation?
As a string player, I can't but recommend the Adagio for strings as well. It's actually originally a string quartet, and I am first and foremost a string quartet musician, so it is really an incredible piece of music. For me, there are some Beethoven string quartet movements which kind of transcend time and space. I'm thinking in particular of the slow movement from his Opus 59 #2 string quartet. He uses this motor rhythm that goes throughout the piece that's so slow and profound, but if you hit just the right tempo, you feel like you're almost hovering off the earth by a couple inches. It's a long movement. It's about 15 minutes long, but if you get into the right mindset, it can feel somewhere between 2 minutes long and 4 hours long. It's just an incredible piece of music to kind of lose yourself into. But yeah, all of the pieces of music that everybody recommended are incredible.
I want to thank all three of you, and so Anne and JD, if you could come back and we'll say our goodbyes. But thank you everybody who spoke today. I wish we could have more time for Q&A. There's some great questions here.
Thanks, Rick, and that was just a really stimulating day. Hopefully Anne will come back in. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. It was just a really great collaboration. Anne did not break anything. We're very happy about that. And thank you, Rick and Anne, for joining us. Is there anything that you'd like to, anything coming up that we need to share with the audience?
We don't have anything for next week. We will be back, but the main thing I want to say is we'll be back with this collaboration between cultural programs and the exchange probably August 5th, I think. We're still working on what that will be, but we hope you'll come back and join us because we'll continue the conversation around creativity and the way in which it is surviving and maybe thriving.
And I will say that we're going to, CPNS is going to host our next Days Your Experiment on July 23rd. That's the third Thursday of July, and we'll be talking about, of all things, fish pain. Do fishes feel pain?
And every time you say that, somebody says to you, did you say fish pain?
So if you're still watching the feed as well, that means you're interested in this. So there are a couple of people I really want to thank and make sure that we do thank for helping us out. First, JD and Alana from CPNAS. It's been such a pleasure to work with you guys on this event, and we look forward to the next one. I want to thank our AV team, Moises and Alex, without whom we would not have been able to play that video. It would have been a mess. I'm telling you that right now. And also everyone in the office in DC, Courtney and Jeff, and also of course Sachi at the exchange. Thank you, especially because I'm on vacation this week technically. So all you guys did all.
Thank you.
I was out doing whatever. I want to thank Danelle Hogan and Sherry Dennis from Stimazing for live tweeting. We just did an event with Stimazing. What was that, a week or two ago? What is time now? And so you should really check out that event if you're interested in what Stimazing is all about. And also our sponsor is Howard Hughes Medical Institute, without whom today's event wouldn't have happened. So thank you. Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Walt Disney, Film Nation, Google, Lida Hill Foundation, Corteva, and all the individual donors, folks like you who gave. Thank you so much. All that goes directly back into making these events happen. So thank you.
So I'm going to go make some dinner tonight, and I'm going to sing and play some music. I hope everyone was equally inspired because our three speakers were amazing. So I think we owe them another round of thanks.